Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 2 is about to begin. But before that, let me take a moment to review a few technical details. Today's webinar will be conducted in English. However, it comes with English-Indonesian simultaneous interpretation. To listen to the translation, click the globe icon or three dots icon, select interpretation, and choose English-Indonesian accordingly. It is advised that you do not click the mute original audio, but should you wish to do so to obtain a clearer audio rendition, please make sure to manually switch off the interpretation when someone in the floor is speaking in the language that you are listening into. This webinar is also available on our YouTube channel, BPPK Kemenkeu RI. That's all the information. Let us now begin the Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 2, how people really learn. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang. Welcome to Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 2, how people really learn. First of all, I would like to thank God the Almighty that has given us blessings to virtually attend this webinar. And I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the Chairman of Financial Education and Training Agency, Bapak Andin Hadianto, the Director of Directorate General of Budget, Bapak Isa Rahmatarwata, and the Board of Directors of the Directorate General of Budget, and Director of State Asset and Fiscal Balance Education and Training Center, Bapak Heru Wibowo, senior officials from the Ministry of Finance and other ministries, agencies of Indonesia. Our special guest speaker, Stewart, Hase, and Chris Kenyon. Best regard to all participants who have joined us today. We are very grateful for the enthusiasm of the participants. And then that we have to announce that we have more than 300 participants who are joining this event via Zoom and YouTube at the moment. Before we begin, let us together sing the Indonesia National Anthem, Indonesia Raya. May all the audiences to stand up. Please be seated. Dear participants, before we begin, we are pleased to listen to the welcoming remarks by the Director of State Assets and Fiscal Balance Education and Training Center, Bapak Heru Wibowo.
Thank you, Mas Dodi. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon to all of you. Honorable, the Chairman of Agency for Education and Training, Financial Education and Training, Bapak Andin Hadianto. Honorable, the Director General of Budget, Bapak Isa Rahmat Tarwata, and the Board of Directors of the Directorate General of Budget. Honorable senior officials from the Ministry of Finance and other ministries, agencies of Indonesia. Honorable speakers, Mr. Stewart, Hase, and Chris Kenyon, and moderator, Ibu Ani, distinguished participants. It is my pleasure to be here and welcome all of you to the Ministry of Finance Learning Week 2021 that are held in half-day webinars from 4th to 8th October. So today is the second day of the Ministry of Finance Learning Week. If you need any information related to the Ministry of Finance Learning Weeks or want to see the detailed arrangement of the event, please kindly check our website and make sure to save your date. A brief information about the Ministry of Finance Learning Week for those of you who join this event for the first time. The Ministry of Finance Learning Week is a festival in which we celebrate learning organization by various events, including, like today, inviting prominent international speakers to share their knowledge and vast experience with us. As for this afternoon, please allow me to extend my great gratitude to the speakers, Stewart Hase, a consultant psychologist from Australia, and Chris Kenyon, an international consultant also from Australia. A big thank you is also extended to our moderator today, Ibu Ani, Head of Jakarta Matraman Tax Service Office. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang berbahagia, as you all know, we are now living in the era of COVID-19 pandemic that soon is likely to become endemic. Thus, this virus has significantly disrupted and altered various aspects of our lives into an unprecedented new norm, including learning. Yesterday, we have been encouraged by Dan Pontefract to think and exercise what will be the optimal learning approach, not only during the pandemic, but also in the post-pandemic era. I know it is a tough question to answer and thus requires collaboration and synergy from all of us to address it. The pandemic, however, has actually opened up opportunities for us to create learning methods that can be accessed from anywhere and anytime. It has proven today, with utilization of technology, we have so many resources to learn and to upgrade our performance. Furthermore, this will also motivate us to learn something that in line with our passion, or commonly called as the concept of self-determined learning, or heutagogy. Hase and Kenyon has determined heutagogy as the study of self-determined learning and applies a holistic approach to developing learners' capabilities, with the learners serving as the major agent in their own learning, which occurs as a result of personal experience. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang berbahagia, today we are so fortunate to have special speakers from whom we know as the founders of this self-determined learning concept. Those are Stewart Hase and Chris Kenyon. The concept is very interesting since it provides a valuable and different approach to learning, not simply an alternative to pedagogy and andragogy approach. The heutagogy approach is insightful since it, among others, improves critical thinking and reflection, also increase learner engagement and motivation, and give learners more control over learning or learner-centered, improve ability for learners to investigate and question ideas and thus apply knowledge in practical situations, make learners more capable and able to adapt to new environments, encourage growth and personal empowerment, and teaches learners to think for themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, Bapak Ibu sekalian yang berbahagia, I will stop here because I'm sure you are all here today to listen to Stewart and Chris, so enjoy your learning. Take this opportunity to learn and grow as a personnel so that we can dedicate the best version of ourselves to organization we are working for. Finally, let me say thank you once again to Stewart and Chris for making time to be here with us today. I'm looking forward to listening and learning from both of you. Thank you and have a fruitful discussion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Bapak Heru Wibowo, for the welcoming remarks. And ladies and gentlemen, now it's the time for the main event that we have been waiting for. But before that, let me introduce the moderator for today's webinar, Miss Ani Natalia, or people in Ministry of Finance love to call her Kak Ani. Nah, Kak Ani works at the Directorate General of Taxes, Ministry of Finance Indonesia. She serves as the head of Jakarta Matraman Tax Office. She holds a master's degree in economics from Yokohama National University, Japan. Apart from her main role as a tax administrator, she is also a certified professional motivator and public speaker. Without further ado, Kak Ani, the screen is yours.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Dodi. It is an honor for me to be here, and I would like to welcome our honorable guests and audience who have joined us today, either in this Zoom meeting or through our YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Allow me to introduce our speakers, Stewart Hase and Chris Kenyon, who will deliver their talk titled, How People Really Learn, Unleashing the Power of Learner Agency to Maximize Organizational Effectiveness. Chris Kenyon is an international consultant and has worked with government in the United States of America, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, almost all over the world. And Dr. Stewart Hase is a psychologist, educator, academic, and consultant who, along with Chris, came up with the idea of pedagogy in the year of 2000. I believe you might have heard about pedagogy and andragogy, but today we are going to learn about pedagogy. Hello, Stewart and Chris. Hi, how are you? It's so good to have, it's so good to have you both here. And I heard that, Chris, you just turned 92 years old last week.
No. 91.
91, all right. Happy birthday, happy belated birthday. So great, 91, but you look really, really young. And you are still 91 young old, yeah? All right, I'll get back to you in a minute. But before we start, I'd like to make a housekeeping announcements to our audience. Ladies and gentlemen, our honorable guests, the talk with Chris and Stewart will go on for about 42 minutes and then followed by 30 minutes of question and answer session. Feel free to ask your questions, and there are several ways to do that. First, if you're joining from Zoom, either write down your questions into the Zoom chat feature, to which I will read them, or you can also click on the raise hand button, and I will call your name when it's time, and you can ask your question directly to our speakers. And if you're joining us through the live streaming on YouTube, please write down your questions into the live chat feature, and I will read them for you. Again, you can either write your questions in the Zoom or YouTube chat box, or by the raise hand feature on Zoom. All right, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our speakers, Stewart Hase and Chris Kenyon. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to just fiddle with the technology and share my screen so that we can... show you some slides. Here we go. Right. I think I've
Halo
shared.
dan selamat datang. Maaf, kami tidak bisa bahasa Indonesia.
Very good. Thanks, Chris.
So we are very pleased to be talking to you. And I'm going to talk to Stewart about self-determined learning.
And I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm going to talk to Chris about self-determined learning as well. What we're going to do today, I was going to say this evening because it's 6 o'clock in Australia. What we're going to do is pretend that we're sitting by a fire and we're having a conversation. So we're going to ask each other questions. So hopefully it'll be very informative and also entertaining in the sense that we'll keep you moving between the two of us. So it will be a bit of a conversation. Thank you very much for attending, and we really hope you'll be excited by the idea of hoitagogi, or probably easier to say than hoitagogi is self-determined learning. Thank you.
So, Stewart, how do we learn?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one that I've spent most of my life trying to work out. I'm not going to be able to fully describe that in the session and the time that we've got, but I will give us some hints and have a little go at it. What I'd like to just ask the audience to do, and you don't have to speak or respond to this, but I'd like you just to think about it. I'd like you to think about one really valuable thing that you learnt in your life that made a difference. Not something trivial, but something that made a difference to your life. So perhaps if all of you could just right now, and I'm not going to ask you what it is, just think of something just for a few seconds. So hopefully you'll have thought of something, particularly if you've had a very long life like Chris and I have. One thing that I'm going to say is that I would guarantee pretty well that you didn't learn it in a classroom. That in fact, the things that we learn that are most valuable to us and the things that we actually remember the most, and the neuroscience, which we'll talk about shortly, about the brain, how the brain functions, they are experiences that we have. They are everyday things, and that we learn things that are contextual and relevant to us, and they make a difference in our lives. So that gives us a kind of a launching pad into self-determined learning, because that's not just at the heart of it, but certainly a part of what it is. How do we learn, Chris? Well, yes, the way in which we've learned since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and probably even before that, if we look at monasteries and other kind of institutions in the Middle Ages, but we've tended to have what we call teacher-centric learning, Chris. And teacher-centered learning means that the teacher is in charge of what we learn and how we learn it. It's a teacher-centered approach. And as you can see there from the picture, it kind of gives us a sense of how that education has worked. Current 21st century learning in this style is an artifact of the Industrial Revolution and was really, really used for mass education. And as we heard in the opening address, which I thought was very, very fascinating, is that we do in fact have a technological era where knowledge and experience is open and available to us, and we don't have to rely upon single people such as teachers. So at the heart of hoitagogi, or self-determined learning, is that we want to focus on the learner. So it's learner-centered rather than teacher-centered. This doesn't mean that you throw the curriculum or the aims of the education process out of the window, but what it does mean is that the learner becomes the center of the learning experience rather than the teacher. So we're interested in what the learner is experiencing. So from an educational perspective, we're interested in guides and not gurus. I've always liked to think that I was a guru, but I don't think it's real, and I don't think it's very, very useful. But guides, certainly. So the educational experience is a guided one rather than teacher-directed. As we heard earlier, but I've put it here in writing for you so that you can actually see it. And you can access this obviously through the slides or through reading about self-determined learning. But you can see there that in the definition, the learner is the major agent in their own learning. Now, again, it doesn't mean that the teacher or the manager or the organization is not involved in the learning, but the learner has to be the center and the focus. And we'll discuss this throughout the rest of this conversation. And the other part of a definition, if you like, that we originally came up with in 2000 when we wrote our first paper is the learner is a partner or agent in designing and realizing their own learning. Now, you can see that this is a very powerful statement given the kind of formal education and the kind of traditional educational settings that we're all used to. I mean, I was raised on this, as a lot of you have been. And I know that the benches and those kind of things reflect schooling, but in actual fact, SDL, or self-determined learning, applies to organizations also. And it's that focus that we'd like to have today. And certainly towards the end of this session, we'll be looking at what the Ministry of Finance can actually do with respect to implementing organizational learning. But just as a starter, just to get, if you like, to whet your appetite, learning in organizations, it involves recognizing the learning, integrating the learning into performance systems and other learning, harnessing it. That might be through something like portfolios, and we'll talk about those later. The learning needs to be built on, and then it needs to be formalized. So that's just kind of a hint of how we might go about this in organizations. So Chris, let me ask you, given that start, how did pedagogy or self-determined learning begin?
Okay, thanks, Stewart. Well, it started when I devised a new course called the Public Sector Executive Management Program at the university where you were, Southern Cross University. Now, this course was a new program for middle-level managers who are going to work in different ministries. The aim of the program was to create consultants who would work within their separate departments. Oh, by the way, we call what you call ministries, we call departments. So I will use both words. They mean the same thing. In Australia, so these people would go back to their departments and solve various problems in their organizations. The program was at postgraduate level, and the participants were all between the age of 28 to 35. So they had quite a bit of life experience. It wasn't like they come straight out of university. They graduated, worked maybe in more than one organization. So they had plenty of work experience. I designed the program to cover many learning areas. These included human behavior, which was an area that Stewart covered, and project management, workplace health and safety, things like shift work, breaks while you're working, communication, which is speaking to an audience, giving presentations, doing interviews, writing reports, software systems. We all have our issues with software systems, and ethics, how to behave when you're solving problems in an organization that has problems. So I started, before I developed the program, to think what would be a good way of challenging the participants in the program. And I thought, well, these are all people who have been specially selected by their departments. So they're very capable, intelligent people. So instead of saying, this is what you have to do, why don't I say, what is it you want to learn, and how are you going to learn it, and how are we going to assess your learning? It's quite a challenge, but we managed to do it. So the idea was that the participants of the program would challenge themselves where that was possible. Now, of course, some areas like the legal bits, you can't really say, I want to learn the law. Everybody has to learn the same laws and so on. When it comes to project management, most people have to learn to do it the same way. But where people could learn to do things in their own way, like communication, for example, they decided what they wanted to learn, how they were going to learn it, and they got approval from me or from another presenter at the university to do that. So the idea was students will learn for themselves where possible, and they will challenge themselves. Stewart.
So what did you actually find, Chris?
So at the end of the first program, the participants firstly said they had really enjoyed the program. Secondly, they had a great more self-confidence. Thirdly, that they had found their way of learning, whether it was going online, whether it was going out to groups, whether it was watching videos, researching with other people. They had found their own way of learning. And lastly, all of them wanted to go on learning. They had become excited by this learning approach, and they wanted to learn more. So, Stewart, where is self-determined learning used?
Well, in the resources that we're going to provide at the end of this session, you'll see that there are quite a number of books and written about self-determined learning, and they mainly consist of case studies, which are written by people who are working all over the world. So those who are really interested in this method, you just need to access those resources to see where it's used. But I have to say that since 2000, when you and I came up with this idea and wrote our first paper, which is a long time ago now, Chris, 21 years, we now find that pedagogy is used all over the world in universities, schools, training systems, and in organizations. It's exciting that both Chris and I obtain roughly weekly inquiries from people doing PhDs or who want to research self-determined learning or doing something in that space. And it's just a very exciting area to be in. So it's really escalated, and it's used in pretty well, most countries of the world in one way or another. But in terms of organizations, it's used in air traffic control systems, which is something Chris was involved in. It's also used in banks, in public sector organizations, in obviously schools and educational institutions, in government areas, in pockets all over the world, particularly the UK, particularly South Africa, Israel, and Australia, New Zealand, and some pockets in Southeast Asia. But what I'd like to do now, Chris, is just as a way of explaining how you might use SDL or self-determined learning in an organization, what I'd like to do is just talk about an experience that I had in working with people who were trained firefighters. And the firefighters that I was involved with in New South Wales are the volunteer firefighters. These are people who attend bushfires. And as you know, we have a lot of those in Australia. And there are something like 70,000 volunteers in New South Wales alone who fight fires. Now, I was working with a bunch of trainers talking about how they might implement self-determined learning into their training and into the organisation of firefighters. And this is one of the organisations in New South Wales that has embraced self-determined learning and use it as a basis for their training and learning. One of the things we talked about was I asked the group of trainers what they would actually do if they had to teach a group of people about how to use a new piece of fire equipment. And most of them said that, well, what we'd do is we would get a manual, we'd learn the manual, we'd go through it, then we'd make some PowerPoint slides, and then we'd get people into a room and we'd show them how to work the machinery, and then we'd discuss the theory, and then we'd go outside, and then we'd show them how to drive it or how to use it, and then we'd test their competence. And that's a pretty standard approach for learning, how we might go about a learning process, which is teacher-centric. So I suggested to them, how about a different way? How about if we went outside straight away and put the manual on the seat or nearby the piece of equipment, no matter what it might be. And what we then do is we ask them to work it out. And I asked them what would happen. And they said, well, most of the people that we work with have been in the fire service for a long time. There might be some beginners, but they usually get mentored and tutored by other people. And I said, well, what do you think might happen? And they said, well, I guess some people would pick up the manual and they'd read it, because some people like to read manuals. And then there are other people who don't like reading manuals, and what they'd rather do is experiment. I'm one of those people. They might want to experiment. And I said, what do you think would happen? I said, well, I think that what they'd do is I'd be there and make sure that nothing bad happened to the equipment or that people were not in danger. But essentially, the people who read the manual would make sure nothing bad happened, and the people who experimented would show the people who were reading the manual how it works. And I just simply asked the group, what do you think the end point would be? And they said, well, in the end, they'd work it out for themselves. And I asked them, how do you think what would be the difference between the learning? And obviously, the learning using the second approach doesn't involve sitting around listening to somebody just talk, but in actual fact allows people to engage themselves in learning and embeds the learning. And what we know about the human brain is that when people are involved in an experience, when they're doing something, the learning experience is more embedded, and memory traces are much more laid down. So it's a much more effective way of teaching. So, Chris, that was one approach that I used with firefighters.
Thank you.
So would you like to give us a couple of examples of how you've used self-determined learning in organizations, Chris?
Okay. Now, I will come to the buildings in a few minutes. Don't get too excited. Nobody's going to hospital. Okay. The organization I worked with, a bit like the Ministry of Finance, we had people all over the country working in different areas. So my role was both a coach and a mentor for self-determined learning. So I would talk to my staff on the phone, and every year I would visit them twice and sit down and talk to them about what they wanted to learn. And if in the meantime they had another idea, they could ring me up and say, Chris, can I share some ideas with you? And we would discuss it. Okay, so the first group, there were two men called Peter and Ashley who wanted to learn more about project management. Their learning style was that they preferred learning by talking to people and doing practical work. The sort of thing that Stewart has just talked about with the firemen. People who like to work with their hands, with the brain, and talking and getting information that way. So I discussed with them their plans for how they were going to do their learning. I provided some guidance because obviously you can't let people go off whenever they want just to learn. So we had to have a program. Firstly, I let them do an advanced project management course. And that was 8 weeks, 1 day a week. And they had one afternoon a week off. And doing the course, they met other project managers and talked to them. And after the classes, they obviously went for a drink, a coffee, a beer or something, and chatted. So that way they got to change ideas with more experienced project managers. Then a few weeks later, I sent them to work with a big project, which was, there was a small hospital which was going to be converted into a very large hospital. This was because the small hospital was in an area near a capital city, which was growing, the population was growing, and there was no room to extend the hospitals in the capital city. Now, the project manager who have been responsible for the project management of the building had created the plan, but it was only for the building of the new hospital. And they hadn't discussed at all or worked out how the small hospital would be integrated into the large hospital, where the patients would move to, what would happen when walls were torn down. And so my two guys spent 4 weeks working very hard, 16 hours a day, project managing the change from the small hospital to the large hospital. When they finished, they rang to talk to me about what they'd learned. And I said, okay, we'll talk about this later. Now, in my organization, we have an annual conference. And at the annual conference, people talk about the things they've learned, what they're hoping to do, and so on. And so Ashley and Peter, who had done this project management, gave a presentation about what they'd learned, how their learning had influenced them, and said, okay, we're not experts now, but if you have project management problems, please call us and we will help you. So in a way, they'd gone from being learners to being mentors. They were going to be able to help others. Okay. At the same conference, after Ashley and Peter had given the presentation, somebody said to me, so how do we know if the project was successful, and how do we measure success? And as you probably know, all around the world, governments have problems with projects. Some of them, they're over budget and late and so on. So how do we evaluate them? I didn't have an answer. So in a way, I was learning from my staff, and I said, okay, I will devise a way of evaluating projects. And 2 years later, I was running evaluation workshops for all our government departments. So I learnt as well as providing guidance. Now, the second example, there was a lady called Anna, and she wanted to learn about changing organizations, or change management, as we call it. We had a discussion about learning ideas and what the outcomes she was looking for. Her style of learning was quite different. She liked to learn by herself. She learned by reading, by going online, by watching videos. And once she had a fair idea of what she wanted, she asked if she could go and spend some time with an industrial psychologist, somebody who could explain why changes in organizations can cause problems. So we paid for that. At the similar annual conference, she talked briefly about what she had learned, but instead of talking and saying, come to me with the answers, she had written a notebook with all the things she had learned, and she gave copies of the notebook to everybody who was at the conference. So you can see that the people learn, and then they pass on the learning, and they still want to learn. So my role was, firstly, I was the mentor for people doing the self-determined learning, and I tried to coach my people. I talked to them, I encouraged them to learn, and encouraged all their efforts. Stewart, what do you see as the challenges for people wanting to learn differently?
Thanks, Chris. I think the biggest challenge for people who want to learn using a self-determined learning approach, and also for organizations who want to do this, is moving from being a passive to an active learner. Now, I talked earlier about traditional forms of education. There's a way in which we become culturally sensitized to learning in a particular way because we're used to sitting in a classroom. We're used to listening to gurus. We're used to going to courses. Now, Courses have a very valuable place to play in learning, obviously. And most of you who are attending this conference would have earned degrees or certificates or diplomas in your area of specialization. And of course, they're essential. But the truth is that if we think more about the 21st century, and in the opening address, this was alluded to, I think in a very clever way, we live in a rapidly changing environment. We're living in a world where change can occur at a moment's notice. COVID-19 is a classic example of how we were blindsided to the possibility of this occurrence. And it has changed the way we think about a whole lot of things. And change can occur very, very rapidly. And I'm sure all of you working in the Ministry of Finance would be aware of that. So we live in a different kind of world than 200 years ago or 300 years ago. We live in a world where we need to react very, very quickly. And I know that most organizations, when they're employing people, they're looking for people who are able to react in this way, who are able to monitor their environment, who are able to be flexible and adaptable in reacting to change. And in order to do that, this is where we start thinking about processes like self-determined learning, where we are trying to get people to become agents in their own learning, where they're able to access learning and learn what they need when they need it. So just-in-time learning. And there won't be time to go to a course. The learning will need to be right at that moment. And of course, this is afforded by the internet. The only thing we need to do when it comes to the internet is we need to be able to sort the wheat out from the chaff. We need to be able to find out and recognize what's useful and what's not. We need to become good researchers. And I'm not convinced yet that most people that use the internet, particularly in social media, Chris, are really, really able to do good research. And that's how we get these nonsense kind of ideas coming out and circulating around social media. We need to create learners who know how to research their stuff. So the point being is that we live in this new world. Now, I was asked just to talk briefly about the other goggies, and it's in this context. Pedagogy is the approach that we've talked about earlier, which was teacher-centered. It's when we need to access a guru, when somebody is going to stand there and tell us what it is we need to know. And that was really the approach that underpinned education and training in organizations and learning in organizations for many, many, many years. And then a fellow called Malcolm Knowles came up with the notion of andragogy. And andragogy is the idea that adults come to a learning experience with previous experience of their own. So they bring their own self, if you like, to that, whereas children don't bring a lot of experience, although I'd like to argue that that may not be the case. In any case, andragogy then is adult-centered learning, and that's where self-managed learning comes from, that idea that people can manage their own learning, which is different to self-determined learning. And when we wrote our first paper in 2000, Chris and I entitled it Moving from Andragogy to Heutagogy. And so it's that adding to the adult approach, but enabling people to become agents in their own learning. So we have pedagogy where it's very much passive, andragogy where it's a little bit more active, and then there's heutagogy or self-determined learning where the learner is very, very active in their own learning. The biggest criticism that we get about self-determined learning is that if I'm running a course or I've got a particular learning project in mind, you're going to throw the curriculum out the window. That is not the case. The curriculum is still a guide. It's still something that's important. And when I'm running training programs, I give the curriculum to the learners and I say, well, this is the guide, but you can learn outside of that. I'm not concerned with the content in learning. I'm concerned with the process. And self-determined learning is more about the process than anything else. The content is easily available these days. You don't have to rely upon some guru to tell you. You can go out and access it. So Chris, I think the biggest challenge is going from passive to active learners. And what happens, as you know, is that we tend to fall into that trap of being a passive learner rather than being an active learner. In fact, I just wonder, this is a bit ad hoc, Chris, but I just wonder whether or not you feel like telling us about your experience with the instructional designers at UTS, the Japanese instructional designers.
Prompt me again, Stuart. I can't remember that.
Oh, when you had some Japanese students came over, and not your students, you had some Japanese students came over to Australia, and they were having problems at working with Australian designers because they were waiting for the master to show them.
Oh, yes, that's right. Okay, so I was called into the College of Design in Sydney. The Australian government had opened a special college with scholarships for people from Southeast Asia. In fact, there were 2 Indonesian students on the course. And the first task on the course given to each student was to design a piece of jewelry and to make a chair, which sounds simple enough, that they were given 2 weeks. And nearly all the students said, well, what does the chair look like? What is the jewelry like? What metals do we use? What stones do we put in? And the teacher said, well, you decide, you make it. And because most of these students had always been taught how to do exactly what the expert jeweler said, or what the expert carpenter, cabinet maker said, they hadn't thought about doing it themselves. They had only learned to copy. They hadn't learned to be creative. They hadn't learned for themselves.
Thanks, Chris. The point of that being that sometimes going from a passive to an active learner requires a cultural shift. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Thanks for that, Chris. I know I caught you out there by asking that question, but I thought it was a really good example of what we were talking about. But we'll look at that a little bit later.
Okay. So, Stewart, I know you like painting. You spend a lot of time painting when you're not playing golf or surfing or fishing. So what have you learned about painting?
Okay, I want to just describe this as another example of how it is that we learn. And this is a very important part of the presentation because it really gets to the heart of the principles and the elements of self-determined learning. So it's a kind of a rhetorical question for people who are listening, and that is, I'm quite sure that when you're not involved in work or a course or whatever, that if you want to learn something, that you'll actually go out and learn it. If you're interested in a new hobby or playing a new musical instrument, that you'll find a way, particularly with the internet the way it is, because you can watch YouTube and other things, so you can go and access information. You'll actually design your own learning process. Now, this works. This is how organizational learning works. This is how we learn in organizations. So it's not just about hobbies, but I want to use this as a bit of a metaphor. So my wife is actually an artist. I'm a bit of a painter. She's an artist. But I was in a very remote area of Australia. We were camping there for a while. And I got kind of bored. I loved being there, but I was bored. And so I picked up her paints, and I'd never painted at all. And I was 65 at the time. So 65. And I started messing about with the paint. So then I really fell in love with painting. And so what I did was, I did what a lot of you people will do. I experimented. I looked on the internet. I started reading about painters, particularly the Impressionists, because I really like those guys. I watched YouTube videos of people who painted, and I chose a couple of people whose styles I liked, and I would follow them. I actually contacted them, and I made a relationship with them, and I sought their advice. Occasionally, I would go to a course, maybe a day's painting workshop. I would find out new information. I would read. nobody else was in charge of this except myself. And I think if you explore the way in which you learn, that's exactly what you do. You go and access the resources and you design it yourself. You even you even decide whether or not you're going to attend a course. And that's how we learn. Now, self-determined learning is often attributed to just to adults. In actual fact, kids learn this way too. If you've got children, you know that what they do is they explore, they hypothesize, they test those hypotheses, so they burn their finger or they fall over and graze a knee or fall off their little bike or whatever, or fall out of a tree. Things happen, and they learn from those experiences. They learn with other people. They learn by failing, and there's a big one. They learn by failing, and in other words, trial and error. And they learn by watching others, vicarious learning. So we learn in this way. We don't learn necessarily, we learn certain important things in classrooms, but most of our learning is done outside of the classroom, Chris, and they're using the same skills that I've described here with learning to paint. I'm still not an artist, but I do enjoy doing it, Chris.
Okay. So what, Stewart, do you think are the elements of self-determined learning?
Okay, Chris, I don't have time here to cover all the principles of self-determined learning, but if you'd like to read our latest book, Unleashing the Power of Learner Agency, all the principles are described in Chapter 2 and Chapter 1 in that book. I will give you access to that if you haven't got it already. But the main elements here, and this diagram was designed by a colleague of ours, Lisa Marie Blaschke, who works in Germany. She's an academic there, and she and I and Chris have done a lot of work together. And she came up with this little graphic. So heutagogic design for organizations and for universities and schools, but for organizations, given we're talking about the Ministry of Finance, the heutagogic design, we enable the learner, and this is up to the management of the organization, to explore, to create, to collaborate, to connect, and really importantly, to reflect. And I'll talk a little bit about that right at the end of this, and to share with others. This is about, as Bill Ford said, it's about knowledge sharing, not knowledge hoarding, but sharing information. So when we design a program in an organization, these are the elements that we're thinking about, Chris.
Okay. So next question. How do you think self-determined learning affects our actual brains? What's going on inside?
Okay, well, I really don't have enough time, and we are coming towards the end to really cover this in great detail. But for people's interest, one of the things about learning is that largely in the past, it's been very anecdotal about how we learn. We just watch by watching people. And it's interesting that quite a lot of learning theories have come out of that and have been demonstrated to be faithfully true to how we learn. But in the last 10 years, Chris, the ability to look at the brain, the technology around neuroscience has advanced so quickly that we can actually see what's happening in the brain when people are doing things, and even when they're learning, when they're experiencing emotions. And so just very quickly, because again, this is covered in our latest book, which is free and online. So it's not a selling point here, but just it's free and online, so you can read about this. But we really know a lot more about how people learn, and strangely enough, it supports most of the tenets and principles of self-determined learning. But here you can see that in the learning cycle, which is just one example here, that active testing, when we're learning, we're testing the environment, we're testing what we learn. The sensory cortices there. We know now that learning is very emotional, and we also know that learning is enhanced when there's an emotion attached to it, excitement or something like that, and even fear, as in certain psychological conditions where we learn things in a fearful environment and then we can't get rid of the memory. But we know that memories are more likely to be laid down when emotions are attached to them. For example, reflection down there in the temporal lobe at the bottom, We know that there is a reflective area of the brain where people do reflect on what they learn, and it's a question of harnessing that if we can. And again, I'll mention that right at the end. And then the prefrontal cortex was really important part of your brain, which is about creativity and creativity and how to harness that. Unfortunately, what happens is that sometimes we create psychological conditions that dampen these areas of the brain rather than activate them. Stress, for example, as you know, Chris, is if we're stressed, then other areas of the brain other than the limbic system, the fight and flight areas of our brain, the rest of the brain shuts down. So we know that one thing about learning is it needs to be in a stress-free environment, and people need to be emotionally involved in the learning and be motivated.
So does that explain why the people who've experienced self-determined learning have this positive attitude to life?
Well, absolutely. And they certainly have a much more positive attitude to their organization. And again, Chris wrote a chapter in the book we mentioned where he describes a lot of people's reactions to self-determined learning. And it's definitely worth a read.
So should we use self-determined learning for all our learning?
No, definitely not. And I refer back to the pedagogy, andragogy, hortagogy, what we call the PAH continuum, that sometimes you do need to access information where you need to get a lot of information quickly. And as I said, in my painting example, I chose sometimes to actually go and listen to somebody, go to a workshop to read certain material. Sometimes, yes, we need to just soak up information. But it's not the only way that we learn, and it's certainly not the best way that we learn. We know, for example, that if somebody talks for 15 or 20, for 10 or 15 minutes, usually the person that they're talking to has gone to sleep, in their brain at least. We know that the brain can't actively involve itself in listening and focusing very carefully for a long period of time. When I've done a day's clinical work, Chris, when I've been really focusing hard on working with clients, or coaching, doing executive coaching with people in organizations, I'm absolutely worn out. So no, sometimes it's good to soak up information.
Okay, so before I go to sleep, Stewart, what does an organization like the Ministry of Finance need to do to implement self-determined learning?
Okay, well, our listeners out there, the 300 people that may still be there, this is basically our last slide, and we want you to finish on this point, trying to make it kind of relevant to what you're doing. If, for example, the Ministry of Finance wanted to use self-determined learning as a framework for its learning in its organization, there are certain things that it probably needs to do. And I've written down just a few of these, but we'll be happy to talk about them in more detail later or at some other time. The first thing is that, like any big change in an organization, you need somebody to drive it. So you need a driver, usually somebody who's very senior in the organization who can drive this. Secondly, I would be wanting to train the managers and make sure that they really understood self-determined learning or whatever flexible learning approach you decide to use, because self-determined learning might not be the only one. But if you wanted to do this kind of learner-centered, learner-agentic learning, then you need to have the managers on board, and they need to be promoting it, because it's through their auspices that people may access learning, their learning, and I'll explain that in a moment. The third thing is that you're going to need cultural change. We actually need the organization as in a cultural sense to start embracing the fact that we're learning throughout the day. I'm sure that most of you learn something new every day, maybe, and that you then use it in some other way. And you're probably teaching other people every day too about how to do things. We need to find ways to harness that, which comes to my next point. I think that if you want to use this kind of approach in an organization, you would need to integrate the learning into performance systems, into succession planning, and you need to, in other words, those processes, those HR processes that are used to help people develop themselves and move forward. So you want to integrate learning that's in the workplace into those processes that you already have got. and that would be critical. You also need to find learning opportunities. Where are the learning opportunities? So things like Chris mentioned earlier, coaching. I would think that for most modern organizations, coaching is a critical way in which people are helped to develop. People have a learning plan through their coaching, and they can have anybody in the organization who can work with them as a coach. And I know a lot of organizations that train people within the organization to be effective coaches, and then they help people learn. And I think my belief is that you can have everybody in the organization can learn to be a coach, and we coach each other. Mentoring obviously is a big one too. So that's a learning opportunity. I would be looking at things like action learning as a workplace process that can be used quite easily to enable people to develop their own learning objectives. The next thing is that we need to be able to harness the learning. And my favorite for this, and we've written a lot about this, is that you need to have people in the organization to have learning portfolios. So each person would have their own learning portfolio where they are able to record their learning. And then what I think organizations can do is they can find a training organization or institution that will then accredit that learning in a informal learning into a formal way. I used to, at Southern Cross University, where I used to work with, I first met Chris many years ago. At our university, we did a lot of this, where we accredited informal learning into our master's programs. And in fact, Chris's program, a lot of that was informal learning, but it was actually incorporated into the master's program that we were running. So I would find an organization that can actually do that. And also spend your training dollar wisely. A lot of training dollars are wasted. Sorry, I can't remember the currency in Indonesia. But anyway, dollars. Dollars are not used often very well with training and can be wasted. So picking training that people really want to use and training that fits into their learning portfolio or into their learning objectives, which have probably been designed through HR, through coaching, and through mentoring. And the last one would be to have a very focused plan about how you would implement this throughout the organization. I would try to use it in a small part of the organization first, but I'm probably telling you stuff that you already need to know. So there are some steps there that, and again, if you're interested, please let me know and I'll write those out for you or talk to you more about those later. So thank you, Chris, for asking that question. That ends our presentation, except for one little activity that Chris has got.
So, okay. I would now like you to take your sheet of paper and to think about answering these questions. These are the sort of questions you consider when you're doing self-determined learning. So the first question is, I would like to learn about. Now, this can be anything, like Stewart said, painting, playing the guitar, growing tomatoes. It could be something at work if you're interested, but something that you yourself want to learn about. And then answer how you want to learn about it, who the people are who could help you, the things you might need, and when you plan to start the learning, if you can, and how you'll be happy when your learning is finished. And we'll give you maybe 5 minutes just to think about it and write down your answers. And after 5 minutes, we'll see what people have to say. Your time starts now.
And if our moderator would like to help with this, we'd be very grateful.
Dari peserta. All right, I think participants, you can start writing down what Chris and Stewart asked us to do. I would like to learn about what you want to learn. Please write it down on a piece of paper. You know what I write? I write about, I would like to learn about driving a car. All right. We have 5 minutes, as Chris said. Please. Yes, participants, you can write down also on the chat box. Like, we're not going to ask you to show your piece of paper, but we want you to be active here, as Chris and Stewart asking us to do. And I believe there are a lot of things that we can learn from practicing this. Thank you. In the column chat, we see that Hartati said, I would like to learn about how to encourage the employee to give the best performance to the organization. Right, maybe you can go to the next question. Okay. And Dewey said here, I would like to learn about how to survive in pandemic situation. I would like to learn Spanish. Nice. And you probably should go to the next question, your preferred way of learning. And here, one participant also said, I would like to learn about graphic design. I believe this is a millennial participant, yeah? All right, I would like to learn about programming. Great.
Okay, I think that's enough time. So these are the sort of things you think about when you say, I want to try self-determined learning. It's not just, oh, it'll happen. You have to think through the way it's going to happen, and you have to talk to people either to get approval or to get encouragement or to get guidance. So that's how you start with self-determined learning. Thank you for listening to us. And now, if you'd like to ask us any questions, we're happy to answer you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just, sure, moderator, sure. I'm looking in the chat room at the moment, and there are some questions there. Should we address those, or would you like to lead this?
All right. Thank you, Chris and Stewart. Very insightful presentations. And I found it very interesting about the heutagogy that you found like 21 years ago, and it applies really well now in 2021. Well, at the time, I believe you didn't know that the pandemic gonna come, right? And
right.
And self-determined learning is shifting from passive to active learners. We want to the participant to engage themselves in learning. And that is
Correct.
very good. And today you just prove it. You ask the participant to write down what they want. And we do have very enthusiastic participants this afternoon. There are a lot of questions, and it's time to address the questions. And I'm pretty sure Chris is very excited. I can tell that he's smiling all the time. All right, and then we're gonna go to the first question. This is from Wardani from the Zoom chat. What are the ideal conditions for implementing pedagogy? Chris and Stewart, please. What are the ideal conditions to implement this?
I think Stewart covered those in his answer to what is needed in the Ministry of Finance in terms of leadership at the top, having programs which are linked to HR and to performance reviews so that it becomes part of the culture. You change the culture so that people are encouraged to think for themselves, to learn for themselves, to become mentors to other people, perhaps. Stewart?
Yes, there's quite a large literature on what's called the learning organisation, and I'm sure a lot of you people there would have read some of it or heard about it, particularly if you're in HR or education. I would recommend that you have a look at some of that literature about how do you create a learning organisation. And some of the conditions are embedded in that. But I think also for an individual, I think we're hardwired. That might not translate very well. I think we're born with brains that are looking to learn. It's a part of the human condition. It's what we do. We learn all the time. And so I think everybody has got the capacity. It's just a question of wanting to go for, or being confident enough, and we call this self-efficacy, or having the confidence to go from being a passive to a more active kind of learner. And also recognizing that we do in fact learn like in a pedagogical fashion all the time. Like if I have a workshop, the first question I ask is, how do you learn a new skill like painting, or how do you learn a new skill at work like using a new computer program, or and the fact is that they don't go to a classroom, they just trial and error, explore, hypothesize, test. So it's a willingness to recognize that we know how to do it, and then just enabling ourselves to have the confidence to go and try.
All right, thank you. And we still have many questions. I hope Chris and Stewart are excited about these participants. And we also would like to invite participants, if you want to ask directly to our speakers, please raise your hand by clicking the raise hand button, and I will call your name. All right, but we still have many questions here, and I would like to read it to Chris and Stewart. The second question is from Hertina Rizky from Jambi Pelayangan Tax Office. Good afternoon. From your explanation on self-determined learning, I get that it's more like letting people learn in their own paces. How do we make sure that they've had a thorough knowledge about a subject? How do we evaluate their achievements in learning and make sure that everyone's achieved the same level of knowledge? All right, please, Chris and Stewart.
I'd like to go for that one because I'm the academic. If I can, Chris, but I'm sure you'll come in. Well, the simple question is that you do what we normally do, is you assess people. Pedagogy or self-determined learning doesn't mean you don't assess. You want to make sure that people are competent in using the fire engine or in using a computer equipment, so you test them. And you need to know that they're competent, so you get them to write something down, or they have to perform in a particular way. The difference might be that in self-determined learning, we like the idea of formative assessment rather than summative assessment. The idea that you get assessed as you're moving along rather than the end. But really, you can just assess them in the same way. In formal education, though, what we ask educators to do is to involve the learner in negotiating the assessment. So they certainly have to perform, but it might be that they perform in a context that's familiar to themselves. If you read more about pedagogy, you'll find that context is a very important concept. And letting people be assessed in their own context might be important. But yeah, we just assess them in the normal way.
And the surprising thing was that when we started, we convinced the university that we could do assessments, and the assessments turned out very well because people were so happy with their learning. Most of our participants scored in the high distinction range for their learning. It was very, very rewarding.
All right.
Yeah, that's. I was actually head of the MBA program at the time, and it's true that these students outperformed our general students dramatically. And largely it's because they were involved in the process very, very closely. And again, if you can negotiate the assessment with the learner, they're much more likely to be involved. So, but yeah, just assess them in the normal way.
Right, yeah, through the assessment. Thank you. We have participant who raised his hand. I would like to call Uda Enof. Uda Enof from Treasury. Are you there? You can, yes, Uda Enof from Treasury. Please ask your question. Please introduce yourself, like your name and your office, to our speakers, okay. And then feel free to ask your question.
First, I will check my microphone. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, very loud and clear.
Okay. My name is Enof. People call me Uda Enof because I'm from Minangnis. And then I'm very glad to meet Mr. Chris and Stewart as a founder of the Kegiatan, and it was in 2000, I think. And the author of the book Experience in Self-Determined Learning. Mm-hmm. What I want to know is in your strategic design process, there's three parts. The first one is learning contract, and the second one is learning activity, which is the strategic design that you show us in the slide before, and then learning outcome. If this theory apply to a personal, not organization, how come the three parts being implemented? That's the first question. The second one is, do you guys offer a program, if I'm not mistaken, and in the beginning of the slide is public sector executive management program to us, or correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you, sir.
Okay. I'll answer the second question first. Stewart and I are no longer connected with the university, so I don't know if the university runs that program. I think maybe it no longer. I know that the university has changed in many ways, and I would doubt that it has that program. But it's possible we could run a program for you if you wanted. Stewart.
Yeah, I'm not sure the program will still exist. And that was a long time ago. I mean, we're talking at probably 1998 when we ran 7-8 when we ran that program. And what we did with self-determined learning was that we sat down and talked to each other about the program and why it was so successful. I mean, that was the thing about the program. It was really, really successful and got such great feedback. And so that's how we came up with the idea of self-determined learning. Having said that, I'd been involved in education, so had Chris, for many, many years in one way or another. And we'd actually been using elements of self-determined learning for a long time. We just didn't know what it was. And so we tried to codify it. And if you look at the literature on self-determined learning, you'll see that it's changed quite dramatically over the last 21 years. And some of the ideas and approaches we've used have just developed as you do in science.
So we ran the program for 10 years, and so we don't know what's happened since then. But Stewart, can you answer the first question? How it relates to individual learning versus organizational learning?
You'll need to. I hope I've got understand the question right. Can you repeat the question? I'm not quite sure I got it. Can you repeat the question, please? You need to unmute your mic. We can't hear you.
I believe the question... Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah,
All
we can hear
right.
you.
Okay, thank you. The
Right.
committee locked my mic, so I can unlock my mic by myself.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, in your books, Experience of Self-Determined Learning, there are three parts of your pedagogic design. The first one is what we call, wait a minute, a learning contract.
Yeah.
And then the second one is learning activities, which is consists of your pedagogic design that you show us in the first slide before, and then learning outcomes. These three design process, do you think that we can implement to us as a personal instead of organization?
Yes, definitely. I do it a lot with myself, but more likely you're going to use those skills in, say, formal coaching, where when you're coaching somebody and helping them develop themselves, you're going to develop probably going to design a learning contract. You're going to decide on resources that you need. You're going to decide and so on and so on. And then you're going to work out what the outcomes are going to be. That's really a coaching approach. And it is just one single way. I think it's more complicated than that. I think there are probably more elements, but you're probably going to do that more in a coaching and in an organizational setting than you are personally. However, having said that, I personally set goals or outcomes that I want to achieve in all areas of my life, and I'm sure that you do too. And then I work out how I'm going to get to the end point. And that would be, what resources do I need? What do I need to access? Who do I need to talk to? What are the steps along the way? So, yeah, I guess the answer to your question is yes, you could personalize it, because I do. And really, if you read some of the work by Don Schern on reflective practitioner, the reflective practitioner model, where reflection is a key component in individual learning, he talks about some of the processes and ways in which you can make that happen. So, yes, it can be organizational, and I think it can be individual.
Okay, that's why your example is to trigger us as a personal, not as an organization. The last exercise.
No, not at all. You can use them for personal or organization. So, for example, the example I gave about the painting, for example, or the, you could apply that to learning a new piece of computer equipment at work, or a new software program, or you can, that was really just a metaphor. You can use it for personal learning, but you can also use it in organizations too.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
That's all right. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. So we know that the self-determined learnings that it can be applied to personal, individual, or to organization. All right, we still have many raised hands. I would like to call Ms. Windrati from Treasury Regional Office. Please introduce yourself and then ask the questions to our speakers. Ibu Windrati.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Chris and Stewart. Hello. Stewart, you say hello to Gold Coast alumni. I'm not belong to them, but I graduated from Australia as well. Okay, my name is Windrati. I'm from Regional Office, Treasury Office. For me, it's such a pleasure to have both of you, to listen to you, to have the seminal study of self-determined learning. And when I put attention to your explanation about this concept, I guess this is such a new concept for me. In essence, it is about how a person can become from passive learner to active learner. So I'm wondering, how do you see this concept with the critical thinking capacity of a person? Because when I saw the elements of this concept, I see like exploring, reflecting. I think it's also part of the critical thinking capacity of a person. And I'm so pleased when you said one of the thing that we have to ponder if we want to implement this concept is about cultural change. Apart from having a driver for it, and also training, and also culture change. Because as I see it in bureaucracy, culture about like we are Asian, right? And Asian culture is quite different with. I think it is in contrast different actually with people from Western countries, and it affects our organization, especially in relation to critical thinking. Sometimes people have a lot of things they want to ask, but because of the culture, there is not like really enabling environment for a person on individual level or even on organizational level to apply this great concept of self-determined learning. Thank you.
Do you want to respond to that, Chris?
Thank you.
Thank you for that comment.
I understand your question because I used to be head of an international college in Melbourne for students from 23 different Asian countries. And it was, as we talked during the presentation, about people who are used to being told how to think, where in the Australian environment, you're told to ask and use your thinking. That's why Stewart said, if the Ministry of Finance is going to do this, you need encouragement right from the top. You need people who say, tell us what you need, tell us what you would like to do, and we will help you. Rather than being, yes, I'm the boss, I will tell you what to do. That's the difference. So if you have people at the top of the organization who believe in using your critical thinking because it's a benefit to you and to your organization, then you can succeed. Okay?
Great. Yeah, great, Chris. And I'd also add, when your first part of your question, which was about capacity, yes, people vary in their capacity considerably about how critically they can be or how creative they can be. And there are genetic and also developmental issues involved in that. But everybody has their level. And one of the things that I've learned in my 71 years is that anybody can learn, anybody at their particular level. And, sometimes maybe you've got to do a little bit more pedagogy, but people, I think people love exploring. People love to test out the world. People really want to make patterns about what they see. As humans, that's what we do most of the time. We're trying to work out how the world works. But I agree with you that will vary according, people's capacity and their level to do that. But I'm sure you could find a level for everybody.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ibu Windrati and also Stewart and Chris. We have a lot of raised hands still and a lot of questions, but unfortunately that we will give one more questions. And for that, I would like to invite Bapak Agung from BPPK.
Thank you. Evening, Stewart and Chris.
Good evening.
It's such a great presentation. I really loved it. Really loved it. One thing that just a small question. Well, I run a few lectures in my campus, and then the things that I'm expected by most of my students to actually deliver the knowledge for them. So they don't actually used to experimenting and doing this self-learning. So what they want me to do, the expectation that I have is that they sort of expect me to deliver the knowledge rather than they go about and read the stuff, read the materials, and then ask questions. No, they want me to say things and then say that this is the right thing to do. And experimenting is not a good way. That's what my impression with them. So I've tried to ask them to do little projects like that can be finished in one or 2 days. And then so far, not great responses from the students. Do you have any tips to actually implement your framework in the students? Thank you. And your Aussie accents. I haven't heard it for so long.
Yeah, well, and your reflection is a really good one. It's very valuable because that's been my experience also. Even only recently, I was doing some teaching online for a university in Australia this year, actually, and I found the same kind of response. They wanted me to tell them what they should know, and I just refused to do it. And I gave them, however, you can ease them into it by maybe doing a bit of pedagogy, a bit of lecturing, but embed activities in the, so if you're giving a lecture, embed an activity so that you only talk for a very short period of time. So you might talk for maybe 5 minutes and then give them an activity where they've got to explore or read something or listen to something and then talk in groups. So what you can do is very gradually wean them off the lecturing process, and rather than just saying, well, go away and explore. But you can still guide their learning by providing resources. So this program I was running in a university was a research program for doctoral students, how to do research. And what I did was I provided all the resources and they could then look further if they wanted to. But it was there, they had to access it around certain activities. So I kind of, in a way, forced them to do it. But I was also there to provide advice and to support them while they went through the learning. So I've got the essential role I had was to support them and not leave them really anxious. I hope that helps.
So, and the little exercise we gave is the sort of thing we normally do in small groups of maybe half a dozen, 5, 6 people. So you get the interaction. This is the introduction to having to think for themselves about what they want to learn and how they want to learn. So that's a way of introducing to people that there is a different way of learning. You can learn this way naturally. You don't have to be taught by a teacher.
Can I just add that there's lots of, thanks Chris, that's great. There were lots of questions I noticed on the chat, and also you've got other, I would be more than happy if you want to send me an email or contact me through LinkedIn or whatever you like. You can get my email address from the organizers. More than happy if you want to send me an email to answer your questions. And if I can't answer it, I'll give it to Chris. So happy to do that if that helps.
Yeah. Yes, we're happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you so very much, Pak Agung, and also Chris and Stewart. I am afraid that due to the limitation of the time, I'd like to close the question and answer sessions. And as Chris and Stewart said, if you want to send emails to both of them, you can, and we will give you the email address. And yes, we saw at the chat lots of questions to both of you, and there are a lot of interesting questions. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, excuse me. All right. I believe that's the end of our today's session with Stewart and Chris, titled How People Really Learn. And it will be useful to bear in mind that heutagogy is shifting from passive to active learners. Again, thank you for being with us today. Chris and Stewart, is so happy to have you here, and I'd like to give the screen back to our MC. Back to you, Dodi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kani, for moderating today's session. It was much appreciated. And also thank you very much, Stewart and Chris, for your insightful presentation today. Ladies and gentlemen, before we close webinar today, I would like to invite the Director of State Finance Polytechnic STAN, Bapak Rahmadi Murwanto, to give his closing remarks. Pak Rahmadi, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished speakers today, and my fellow officer of the Education and Training Agency. I believe for the last 2 years, all of us have obtained a fruitful session. The second day of Kemenkeu Learning Week has given us a broader view of what we call self-determined learning. We have learned a lot from Stewart and Chris, our speaker today. Stewart and Chris, thank you for your sharing today. You are very amazing. You are the dynamic duo for today. You have delivered an amazing presentation. The question and answer session was very, very interactive. I believe we have gained lots of knowledge from you, learn how to motivate ourselves to learn. Hopefully, we can meet again in the future to have more discussion and sharing session. Ladies and gentlemen, Stewart Hase and Chris Kenyon talking about Koji. This may be a strange term for us, even for me. Actually, I tried to Google this before I deliver this closing remarks, since we have yet to use the term in the Ministry of Finance. But actually, we already have engaged what we call Koji by delivering an individual learning needs analysis. Even we ourselves, every day, use this kind of methodology to learn in our lives. Koji become one of the learning focuses of learning organization. Each of individual in the learning organization can choose learning according to his or her own will. When the passion of learning is developing in the case of individual learning, the focus of intensity is very strong within individuals. To give you a little bit perspective, here's a little bit of my observation how effective people learning using this Koji. During this pandemic era, the period today, in short period of time, suddenly there are a lot of women who become expert in gardening. It's just amazing. And the same can be said that there are a lot of men who can explain in details about bicycles. If somehow we can use this approach to prepare ourselves for the future, success will come to us eventually. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have 3 more speakers from tomorrow until Friday. And tomorrow we will have Ulrich Bosser talking about learning how to learn. He wrote, Learn Better, Mastering the Skills for Success in Life, Business, and School, or How to Become an Expert in Just About Anything. In the book, he maps out the new science of learning, showing how simple techniques such as self-questioning can help people gain expertise in dramatically better ways. Among the important findings and practical tips, and tell a series of fascinating stories. We look forward for seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Rahmadi, for the closing remarks, which also concludes today's webinar. To all participants who join us today, we would like to say thank you for your participation, and don't forget to give your feedback about this webinar by filling the evaluation form via the link that we shared in the chat box. Stay safe and healthy. See you tomorrow on Ministry of Finance Learning Week Day 3 with the theme Learning How to Learn with Ulrich Bosser. I am Dudi Septariza. Good day and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Chris, Stewart. That's nice to over to you.
Recordings